Okay, good evening. Welcome. Thank you again for joining us for Series 1, Shiur 2 of the Medical Halacha Chaburah. Just a few words of introduction. One unrelated matter, but upcoming Kollel program. So we just announced that we are running a very special program beginning on Tu B'Shvat. It's going to be a 4-week brachos challenge, and the idea is to transform the way we make brachos. It's going to be very meaningful, and it involves a daily dvar chizuk followed by a daily challenge that will accustom us to making brachos with kavana, which can really transform our day and transform our relationship with Hashem. And it's bit by bit, slowly growing over 4 weeks, and I think that it can have lasting impact in the way that we make brachos and daven, and I encourage people to sign up for that. A email went out this evening, but you can also go to the Choli website and poke around to find it. On the subject, that's actually done over a WhatsApp group. On the subject of WhatsApp groups, there is a WhatsApp group associated with the Medical Halacha Chaburah. It has not seen so much action yet, but there may be opportunities on there that get shared there. So we encourage people to join that WhatsApp group. You could find the link in the email that went out this afternoon, as well as on the Choli website on the Medical Halacha Chaburah page. Um, Turning to this evening, so I first want to begin by thanking our sponsor for this evening's shiur. This shiur is sponsored by Margie and Michael Horowitz in memory of Yitzhak ben Yechiel Michal Halevi, Isaac Horowitz, and Chai Rachel Bas Avram Meir, Rose Rogoff. Thank you very much, and in the zechus of our learning, the Neshama should have an aliyah. Thank you again to the committee for the Medical Halacha Chaburah for helping publicize and bringing more people in. And of course, thank you, Rabbi Grossman, for your hard work in preparing and delivering. I should mention that Ezras Hashem, Rabbi Grossman, will be coming to Silver Spring for the Kollel Shabbaton at Young Israel Shomer Yamuna at the end of February. So mark your calendars. That's Parsha Zachor, February 27th, 28th, I think, and right before Purim. And we look forward to seeing you and learning from you in person again. So I think that is everything for the introduction. So now I will turn the microphone over to Rabbi Grossman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shaps. I want to reiterate also, as Rabbi Shaps said, I want to thank Rabbi Michael Siegelman, the committee, for putting this together, everyone for attending, and I certainly want to thank Michael Horowitz for the sponsorship, as well as the very, very kind and gracious feedback he provided to us after the first shiur. So let's turn to criticism. After I gave the previous shiur, my friend Rabbi Siegelman expressed a little bit of dismay or perplexity he said that people asked me questions about whether various types of situations would be called pikuach nefesh or suffix pikuach nefesh, a case of at least a possibility or maybe pikuach nefesh. And he said I was hesitant. I was reluctant to just straightforwardly come out and say if there's any chance of pikuach nefesh, we have to be Machal Shabbos. If you don't know, or unless you're sure that it's absolutely safe, we should be Machal Shabbos. Isn't that the halacha he told me? So I don't remember exactly what we said, but that is actually going to be the theme of the theme that we're going to be exploring tonight. On the one hand, it is true that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos, and most mitzvahs, and even a suffix, and even a less than 50% suffix, even a small chance of pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos. On the other hand, it's not absolute. It's nuanced, and it's not quite so simple. And as we'll see, it's defining it and establishing limiting principles is a fascinating and tricky endeavor, but that's what we're going to be doing tonight. I'll open with a story that illustrates this very well, kind of both positions, Rabbi Siegelman's and mine, on this topic. This story appears in the opening of a very interesting paper, very interesting article by Rabbi Mordechai Halpern. Rabbi Mordechai Halpern is one of the leading experts on medical halacha today in Eretz Yisrael. He was particularly close to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He had some association with Rabbi Yashiv as well. He tells a story. He published this shortly after Shlomo Zalman died, 90s, I think, and he says, 35 years ago, he says, he says, from 35 years ago, I was asking questions to Shlomo Zalman, and he says, 15 years ago, so about 1980, he says, the following incident occurred. Friday afternoon, winter Friday, short Friday, Friday afternoon, he's called to the phone. Parents are missing a child. The child was in yeshiva. The child was in yeshiva. He was supposed to come home for Shabbos. Disappeared. They called his friends. They said that he's gone. He hasn't been seen in yeshiva for 3 days. He just evaporated. No one's seen him for a few days. His tefillin were left there. His tefillin are there. He doesn't seem to have gone anywhere deliberately. He just vanished. It's been 3 days. Parents are quite agitated. What should we do? So there had been some demonstrations in the city, and the police had made sweeping arrests, and perhaps he had gotten arrested. He called the Russian compound, the police. No one by that name we don't have anyone there in the prison. He checked car accident records, no record of him being involved in an accident. It's getting very close to Shiur. He says he doesn't know what to do. Shabbos begins. He says he sees Rabbi Yashiv. He was in Mea Shearim apparently. After davening Friday night, he asked Rabbi Yashiv, "What should we do? Is this pikuach nefesh? Should I start being Machal Shabbos, phone calls? Should I start activating search and rescue, the missing persons? Is this pikuach nefesh? Should I start doing whatever is necessary, which would probably entail some degree of pikuach nefesh, to look for this kid?" So he says Rabbi Yashiv thought a little bit, and Rabbi Yashiv said decisively, who said this bacher is really in any danger? Who said that Yorchel Shabbos is really going to help if he is? Rabbi Yashiv said this is too speculative. This is we're not absolutely sure that he's safe, but Rabbi Yashiv felt this was just speculation and grasping at straws. This does not constitute a real situation of pikuach nefesh. Therefore, Rabbi Yashiv said no chil Shabbos. The next morning, he says, he walked from Mea Shearim to Givat Mordechai. He gave a share there. And he says he passed Shari Chesed. So he coordinated when Rabbi Yashiv was finished davening in the Groshul. And when Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was finishing davening in the Groshul, I walked him home, he says. I told him the story. And I told him what Rabbi Yashiv said. And I told him I wasn't so comfortable with Rabbi Yashiv's approach, particularly in light, Rabbi Halpern says, of the principles of Pikuach Nefesh that he learned from Shlomo Zalman. So what do you say about this case? So Shlomo Zalman thought about it a little and told him, this is Pikuach Nefesh, travel, do everything you need to do, try to find this kid. He says, can I wait a couple of hours? I'm supposed to give a share. Lots of people are waiting. I'm supposed to give a share now. Rav Shlomo Zalman said, absolutely not. This is Pikuach Nefesh, no delay, start the searches. So he did. He got another his brother-in-law, another Talmud Chacham involved. They contacted the police. They went here. They went there. They were about to start doing a full-blown search, but they decided they would check the prison one last time. They would go there in person. Sure enough, they found the kid. He had been caught up in the arrests. He had been in the neighborhood. He had gotten swept up in the arrest. There was some kind of snafu in the records, why they didn't have it originally, apparently. But sure enough, they found the kid, and everything was fine. So Rabbi Halpern follows up. He says that Rav Shlomo Zalman, when he encountered he says his brother-in-law went to Rav Shlomo Zalman to tell him that it turned Baruch Hashem, the kid was found. Rav Shlomo Zalman was worried that maybe he would feel guilty that he was Machal Shabbos for no reason. Rav Shlomo Zalman said, no regrets, no second guessing. This was the right call. Unlike Rav Yashiv, apparently, Rav Yashiv turned out to have been right. He wasn't in any danger. He was safe and sound in an Israeli prison. He wasn't very comfortable or happy, perhaps, there, but he was not in any actual danger. Rosh Shlomo Zalman said, no regrets. 2020 hindsight that's fine, but that's not relevant. We made the right call, he says. As far as we knew, the kid was missing. We have to treat this as pikuach nefesh and do the same thing again if this happens again. If somebody's missing and who knows where he is, he might be in danger. The fact that we can't solidly identify a clear and present danger, we don't know. He might be in danger. That's enough of a reason. You'll be rewarded by Hashem. You did the right thing. So this machlokas, we'll return to this a little more later. another machlokas between Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rabbi Yashiv about a similar question. This machlokas, fundamentally, these are kind of two different approaches to pikuach nefesh. Rav Shlomo Zalman said, like Rabbi Siegelman had said, if you don't know, you don't know. The fact that you can quantify and precisely define the parameters of the risk, if you don't know, then you're Machal Shabbos. Whereas Rabbi Yashiv took the position that I was taking, that I may have taken, that the just not knowing, just ignorance that we don't know doesn't automatically make pikuach nefesh. We have to have some concrete basis to call it pikuach nefesh. Again, these are not really rules, but we'll see. We'll enter more precisely into what some of the rules and criteria are. But we see here two very different approaches, two philosophically different approaches to how to identify and characterize a situation as pikuach nefesh. So now let's start from the beginning. Let's go back and see some of the primary sources on uncertain pikuach nefesh and Shabbos. The discussion begins in Maseches Yoma, Mishnah, Gemaras, a couple of line of Gemaras. The Mishnah already establishes the rule that Safek Nefashos is Doches HaShabbos. We discussed in the previous, in the inaugural share, we discussed the Gemara has different sources, different derivations for the rule of Pikuach Nefesh is Doches HaShabbos. But whatever the sources are, the Mishnah, Rabbi Masim and Charash in the Mishnah says in Yoma that even if it's only Safek Nefashos, we're talking about a case that somebody has some kind of ailment of his throat, Choshesh Begrono, you can be Machal Shabbos. It's Safek B'Nefashos, only Safek, but doesn't matter. Kol Safek Nefashos Doches HaShabbos. Mishnah goes on. Mishnah gives another example of Safek, Nafla Alav Mapolos. Someone has been buried by a rock slide, or we're not even sure if it's a someone. Safek Sham, Safek Eina Sham. There might be a person there might not be a person there. If he is there, Safek Chai, Safek Mei, Safek he's still alive, Safek he's already dead. Safek, if he is there and he's still alive, we're not sure who he is. Might be a guy, might be a Yisrael. You have these various fakas. Nevertheless, we're Machal Shabbos, Mafakin Alav Esagal. We are Machal Shabbos to potentially save somebody's life, potentially save a Jew's life. The Gemara goes through various other cases of Safek. In particular, when it discusses the case of Mapolis, the Gemara says, "My Ka'amar." The Mishnah gives three different sfekas. The Gemara says, "Lomi boy Ka'amar," that these sfekas are different or different chedushim in them. But the Gemara is not clear whether the Mishnah is talking about. The Gemara is not entirely clear as to whether the Mishnah is talking about these three sfekas independently. There's only one suffix in each case, but there are three different sfekas you could have. But the Mishnah is only talking about a case where there's one suffix, or if the Mishnah means even if all three sfekas together apply, we're not sure if anybody's there. Even if he is there, we're not sure he's Jewish. Even if he's Jewish, we're not sure he's still alive. Even when all three sfekas are there together, and the only reason to be Machal Shabbos, the only justification for being Machal Shabbos is if all three sfekas line up the right way, he's there, he's Jewish, and he's still alive. Nevertheless, maybe the Mishnah means we're still Machal Shabbos, even though there are multiple sfekas. So the Maggid Mishnah, the Lechem Mishnah, both argue, and the Maggid Mishnah says, the Lechem Mishnah explains and defends the position that the Mishnah means to say, the Gemara means to say that even if there are multiple sfekas, we are still Machal Shabbos. Even if multiple sfekas have to be answered in the right way in order for there to be a legitimate basis for Chil Shabbos, nevertheless, as long as there's a chance of Pikuach Nefesh, even if it involves multiple assumptions, we will still be Machal Shabbos. The Gemara itself talks about in a case of Rov, in a case where there's a Rov against the justification of being Machal Shabbos. The Gemara talks about a case where there are nine non-Jews and one Jew, and you're not sure who the person that you're saving is. The halacha is, according to the Gemara, you're not Machal Shabbos to save a non-Jew. Poskim generally say that today things are different for various reasons, that today we do save non-Jews, but in Medina de Gemara, we're not Machal Shabbos to save a non-Jew, a pagan of their time. We're not Machal Shabbos. So even if there are nine, even if it's 9-1, probability-wise, statistically, the person who you're saving, there's a 90% chance he's a non-Jew. 9 out of the 10 people in the pool that you're looking at are non-Jews. Only one is a Jew. You're still Machal Shabbos. And the way the Gemara puts it is, the Gemara says that lo halchu b'pikuach nefesh achar arov, even though in Kol HaTorah Kula We have a principle, Achri Rabban Lahatos, that we follow Rov. When it comes to Pikuach Nefesh, we don't follow Rov, even if the Pikuach Nefesh is only a miut. There's only a small chance, or one out of a larger number that there is indeed a legitimate and eligible case of Pikuach Nefesh. We are still going to be Machal Shabbos. We're still gonna we're still going to violate the Shabbos or do any other. Oh, we override any other transgression in order to save the person who might be alive. So these are the two principles established by the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the Poskim, that not only, as we said last week, is Pikuach Nefesh, Docha Shabbos, override Shabbos, and almost any other mitzvah in the Torah with a few exceptions, even if it's a suffix, even if it's a case of doubt, and even if it is, according to many poskim, even if there are multiple doubts, still, as long as there's a possibility that someone's life, that a Jew's life is in danger, we're going to violate the Shabbos. And the Gemara says, additionally, even if it's a rov, even if it's a majority, even if statistically or in terms of the number of bodies we have, there's a rov that there is no cause to Machal Shabbos, we are going to Machal Shabbos anyway, because Ein Holchem B'Pikuach Nefesh Achar HaRov, we don't follow the rov. We are going to Machal Shabbos even for the minority chance that there is a basis to Machal Shabbos. The Meiri actually brings an opinion that in the case of Svek Sveka, if there are multiple Svekos, multiple doubts that have to be overcome in order to Machal Shabbos, we would not be Machal Shabbos. He himself strongly rejects that position, and the consensus of all the poskim is that even if there are multiple doubts, so even if there's a rov, a majority against it, even if there are multiple doubts that have to be all answered the right way to justify Chil Shabbos, we do it because, and that's the basic rule that I think people are widely familiar with, that the Pikuach Nefesh doesn't have to be a certainty. It can be a possibility. It could even be a relatively small possibility. We are still Machal Shabbos. That is, again, we're talking about Chol Shabbos, but the same thing applies to violate most other Averis in the Torah, with, again, limited number of exceptions. That's the basic principle that emerges from the Talmudic discussion. Tosfos commenting on the Gemara. Tosfos says, why? Why? The Gemara just says the rule, that we don't follow Rov, we don't follow the majority and let the person die. Even if there's a minority chance, we're Machal Shabbos. Why? Intuitively, we understand that because human life is very precious. But Tosfos gives kind of a formal basis for the principle, a formal derivation. We saw in the first class that one of the primary bases for the rule that we would transgress any mitzvah in order to save a life is because the Torah says v'chai bahem, you shall live. Hashem says by my mitzvahs, v'chai bahem, and not sheyamas bahem, not that you should die. Tosfos says, the Ri in Tosfos says that we take that drasha one step further and we say it means lo sheyamas bahem. There shouldn't be any chance of misa. Shelo yavo yuchal lavo b'shum inyan l'demisas Yisrael, that you should conduct yourself in such a way that there is no possibility of a Jew dying, that you have to completely avoid any chance of a Jew dying, and do whatever, override, transgress, whatever mitzvahs and averos you need to, in order to completely eliminate, to the extent possible, any possibility of a Jew dying. That is the basic principle. That is the basic principle that emerges from the Mishnah and the Talmud, and that is the Halacha. Now the question is, again, limiting principles. Even if it's a miut, even if it's less than 50%, even if there are multiple doubts, multiple sfekos, is there any limit? This is a question that's particularly interesting to me, how Halacha treats risk in general. Well, Rav Asher Weiss, we'll get to some of his comments later, but Rav Asher Weiss makes the trenchant, it's a classic Rav Asher Weiss observation. He says, I have already explained at length in many times, he says, that Gedolei Yisrael, that great Torah scholars from the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara until recent authorities, he says, they never established halacha based on achuzim, based on percentages, he says. Because lo asku b'statistika, he says. They didn't study statistics, he says. They didn't speak the language of math and statistics, he says. So they never gave quantitative frameworks for deciding halacha. This comes up a lot in other areas of halacha as well. For example, when we talk about how when you check produce for bugs, So you don't need to check if the chance of infestation is very low, is an outlier possibility. You do have to check, even if it's not certainly infested, but you do have to check if there's a what we call a mir hamatzui, a likely possibility, even if it's less than 50%. So poskim have begun to, in practice, we need numbers. In practice, how do we explain what's called matzui, what's called a substantial enough possibility that we have to check vegetables in those cases. So some poskim today do often try to use percentages, but traditionally, certainly before a few hundred years ago, that was not commonly done. The poskim just use qualitative terms like matzui and shchiach. It's prevalent, it's common, it's frequent, which is very hard to establish legal rules based on that. But Rav Asher points out that when it comes to pikuach nefesh, we don't really find in the early poskim much in the way of a quantitative framework, but we need one. How else do we make decisions? Or maybe there are other principles we can use aside from numerical, quantifiable rules. So that's what we have to decide now. Are there any limiting principles on this idea that even for a small chance of pikuach nefesh, a small chance of danger to life, we're going to allow and actually require the transgression of any mitzvah in the Torah? What are the limiting principles? Are they statistical or otherwise? So one of the earliest relevant comments is a famous comment of the Magen Mishnah. Magen Mishnah, the foremost commentary on the Rambam. Magen Mishnah is commenting on an interesting ruling of the Rambam, at least how he understands the Rambam. This is something that we're going to discuss, actually, I hope to discuss in a later installment in this series. But the question is, when you have someone whose life is in danger, Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah, so we're Machal Shabbos. We do almost anything that we can do to save his life. Should you try to minimize the transgression? Let's say it's Shabbos, and you have to do a malacha, you have to violate Shabbos. You can do malacha with a shinui in an unusual way, which can mitigate the severity of the prohibition. It's still asur, but it might not be daraisa. It minimizes the severity of the prohibition. Should a person, when he's treating a Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah, should a person try to minimize the transgression of Shabbos by doing things like shinui? So that's a major discussion. We're not really going to enter into it in detail today. But the Rambam, as understood by the Magen Mishnah, distinguishes between two cases. The general case of Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah, the general case of someone whose life is in danger. The Rambam says, Machal Shabbos, he makes no mention of shinui, no mention of trying to do it in an unusual way. But when it comes to the specific case of a woman in labor, a woman who is delivering a baby, the Rambam starts by saying that such a woman is considered to be in Sakanah nefashos, in mortal danger. However, here the Rambam says, V'kol she'efshar l'shanos, to the extent that it's possible to minimize the Chil Shabbos by making a shinui, by doing it in an unusual way, we encourage that. In EFshar, if it's not possible, then she's in danger, so you can do it without a shin. So the Magen Mishnah understands the Rambam to be saying that yoledes, a woman in labor, has a special rule. A regular Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah, we do not require a shinui. For a yoledes, for a woman in labor, we do. What's the difference? Why are these two cases treated differently? Magen Mishnah says, Vatam b'zenira, it seems the reason is because childbirth is natural, hen kedavar tivila. I mean, natural can be lethal. Polio is natural. Cancer is natural. There are lots of things that are natural, but it's natural. That's the first step, he says. Ve'ein achas me'elef mesa machmas leida. Not 1 in 1,000 women die in childbirth. The numbers actually are still fairly similar today. They're obviously lower in developed countries, higher in less developed countries, but the numbers are still ballpark, certainly for worldwide, are still in the range, within an order of magnitude, I think, of 1 in 1,000. And the Magen Mishnah says the risk is very, very low. So therefore they require a shinui. But a regular chola where the risk is higher, they don't require a shinui. A regular Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah where the risk is substantial, they don't require a shinui. When it comes to yoledes, the woman in labor, the risk is very, very low. The risk is less than 1 in 1,000, and therefore they require a shinui. So the Magen Mishnah is telling us, establishing quite a fascinating rule. Even a yoledes is still called Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah. Her life is still in danger. If you can't do a shinui, the Rambam explicitly says, Chal Shabbos without a shinui. So shinui is not strictly required. She's considered bona fide Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah. However, she's a very low risk Choli sheyesh bo Sakanah, less than 1 in 1,000. So it's still enough to be called Safek Pikuach Nefesh. It's still enough to allow Chil Shabbos without a shinui, but a shinui is recommended if possible. A higher level risk, where the risk is 1 in 4 or 1 in 10 or 1 in 50 or something like that, is considered a full-blown chol sheyesh bo sakana, and we don't even recommend a shinui at all. It's completely mutter with no need for a shinui, no need for any kind of mitigation of the isser, of the transgression. But when it comes to yoledes, because she's a very low risk, it's enough risk to be called sakana, but because it's very, very low risk, there still is, there we require a shinui. Okay? So the Magid Mishnah, putting aside the technicalities of shinui, the Magid Mishnah is still telling us that even less than 1 in 1,000 is still considered a substantial enough risk to allow for Chil Shabbos. However, Rav Asher Weiss points out, we do have a number of statements in the poskim that indicate that there is some kind of threshold, and once the risk drops below a certain point, even if we can still meaningfully call it risk, it no longer justifies Chil Shabbos. We're not going to have any kind of number for this, but he brings a couple of sources in the poskim that indicate that there is some kind of threshold, that if the risk is so low, even if it's still meaningful to call it risk, we're not going to allow Chil Shabbos. One case he brings was a fascinating discussion from the 15th century. That it went to the Trumas Hadeshin, Rabbi Yisrael Isserlin. It's recorded both in the Trumas Hadeshin and with more of the background details in a work of his disciple, the Leket Yosher. The case was there was a fire. There was some kind of conflagration, and there was a concern for property. The people were basically okay, but there was a concern for property. So they took property and they put it in some kind of cellar, some kind of subterranean chamber. There was a concern. This cellar had a skylight, had a door in the roof. They were concerned the fire would get into the door in the roof. So they were Machal Shabbos. People were Machal Shabbos they moved earth, and they built and they used dirt and earth to seal the hole, prevent the fire from getting in. They realized afterwards they shouldn't have done this. Kind of in a very poignant way, when the people who related the question, they said, we did all this, we were so terrified of the fire, mishum habahalos, because of the chaos and the terror, we forgot that we can't do this on Shabbos. We thought that Shabbos was just totally mutter, even when the only danger is to property, when there's no danger to people. The question of whether a typical house fire is considered pikuach nefesh is a fascinating question. In the Talmudic paradigm, and this was the case for many centuries afterward, a house fire was not necessarily by default considered mortal danger. If people could be safely gotten out, there was nobody stuck in the house, there was generally no presumption that putting out a fire was permitted because of pikuach nefesh. Just leave the house and let the house burn down. Beginning in the medieval era, there was some discussion of pikuach nefesh, but that was for other reasons, social reasons. There would be mobs of looters, and there would be people angry at the causes of the fire. There would be social problems, but not that the fire itself was considered a danger to life. Beginning in the 17th century or so, there were some poskim who began to say that fire should be considered automatically dangerous to life, because even if you're getting out and your immediate family's getting out, the fire can spread, and who knows, maybe there'll be somebody who's sick and somebody who won't get out fast enough. And in practice, my sense is that today, many poskim do consider a house fire to be automatically pikuach nefesh. We don't start asking, is everybody okay? Let's let the house burn down if everyone's safe. Some poskim disagreed, particularly in Israel, where the construction is more stone and less cardboard. Some poskim were not convinced, even today, that a house fire is pikuach nefesh. But I think if you ask your local Orthodox rabbi in general, you will be told that you should assume any uncontrolled house fire is pikuach nefesh, and you should be machal Shabbos to do whatever you can to deal with it. But the assumption here in the medieval era was that the house fire was not pikuach nefesh. It was only a danger to property. And therefore, by hiding the property, there was an issue of Chil Shabbos, of acting improperly. They asked the Trumas Hadeshin. It was after the fact. It was too late to do anything about it. They wanted to know, do we have to do tshuva? Tshuva back then was a pretty rigorous process. It wasn't just internal. They required all kinds of self-mortification and fasting and so on. They asked the Trumas Hadeshin, how serious is our avera? Were we guilty of Chil Shabbos? Do we have to do tshuva? What kind of tshuva? So the question was passed along to the Trumas Hadeshin, and he says, Chil Shabbos, you need serious tshuva. And he says, even though he says the Or Zarua, one of the great early German Rishonim, even though the Sefer Or Zarua writes that there is a concern because of the bandits I mentioned earlier, because of the looters, that there is a chance of getting into an altercation with looters could result in deaths. That if there's a fire that's out of control, it will attract looters like flies to honey, and the danger of a fatal confrontation with looters is real. So does that apply over here? So the Session says no for a couple of reasons. One of his reasons is he says that even after the Or Zarua said that the danger of a fatal conflict with looters is something to think about, he says, is a real consideration. He says he was only matir and Isser D'Rabbanan because of that. He only allowed the overriding of a rabbinic prohibition because of that. But if we're dealing with a malacha daraisa, a biblical prohibition, like the sealing off this hole with dirt would be a biblical prohibition of building on Shabbos, he says because of this relatively remote chashash sakana, because of this concern, either maybe it's not permitted because of that. In one nusach in the Leket Yosher's version, he says vadai it's not permitted because of that. So Rav Asher Weiss notes, on the one hand, the Or Zarua said there is a concern for mortal danger for these looters. On the other hand, the Trumas Hadeshin says whatever this concern is, it's a very remote concern. It's not the most likely outcome here, he says. It's only enough of a reason to allow Chil Shabbos D'Rabbanan, rabbinic violations of rabbinic prohibitions, not Chil Shabbos D'Oraisa. So you see that even though there is a real danger, it's enough to allow the violation of rabbinic prohibitions. It's not apparently considered a concrete danger that would allow the violation of Chil Shabbos D'Oraisa. So you see that a very, very remote and far-fetched scenario, Halacha does consider it. It is something that's real. It's not just wild paranoia. It's real enough to allow the violation of an Isser D'Rabbanan, but it's not enough of a concern. It's not considered real, full-blown Pikuach Nefesh. It's not enough to allow the violation of an Isser D'Oraisa. Similarly, Rav Asher points out we have a comment of Rabbi Kiveger. We have who also indicates that there's such a thing as remote pikuach nefesh, which halacha would recognize as a consideration, but would not consider full-blown pikuach nefesh to allow chil Shabbos d'oraisa, biblical violations of Shabbos. Rabbi Kveger is going on a Gemara interesting Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara says if they had a shraga de chanukta, they had a chanukiah, a Chanukah menorah. Now they had these Persian religious fanatics who didn't tolerate Persian Zoroastrian fire priests, according to the Steinsaltz Faria translation, who didn't tolerate fire. That only if you were a member of their church, a member of their elite, could you have fires, and ordinary civilians who had fires could get in trouble with these priests. So the question was, the Ner Chanukah is muktzah on Shabbos. Normally we don't manipulate, we don't move fires and candelabras and chanukiyot, etc. But what about the concern that these priests you're gonna get in trouble if they catch you, if they're coming through the neighborhood and you have your menorah lit and burning and they see it, you're gonna get in trouble. So can you move it? Is there any justification for moving it? So the Gemara says yes, because it's a shas adchak, because it's a difficult exigent circumstance, you're allowed to move the menorah. Why? The Gemara explains, Kidayu Rabbi Shimon lismach alav b'shas adchak. The machlokas, whether muktzah, the laws of muktzah, again, not our topic today, it's a very, very complicated discussion, but the laws of muktzah are the subject of a considerable machlokas among the Tanaim between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda is stricter, Rabbi Shimon is more lenient. Rav normally rules strictly in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda, but in the case of shas adchak, in exigent circumstances, we can rely on Rabbi Shimon. Kidayu Rabbi Shimon lismach alav b'shas adchak. This expression, Rabbi Shimon is sufficient, is worthy to rely on him b'shas adchak, is much better known to the world at large for its kind of allegorical interpretation to mean Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is worthy of being relied on when a person is in trouble. But the real meaning of the phrase is that Rabbi Shimon is an eminent enough authority that even if we normally would be stringent and not follow his ruling, in the case of exigent circumstances, we follow his ruling and we waive the laws of muktzah. What is the shas adchak? What are these Persian fire priests going to do if they catch you? Rashi says Sakanah. It's a question of danger, which Rabbi Kveger says means mortal danger, danger to your life. If they catch you with a fire, an unauthorized fire, your life may be in danger. So Rabbi Kiva asks, if your life is in danger, who needs Rabbi Shimon? Let's say nobody would say that muktzah, everyone would agree that muktzah is asur. Muktzah is overridden in the case of mortal danger. Even Chil Shabbos Daraisa, the 39 malachas, the 39 categories of biblically prohibited work are set aside in the case of danger. So who needs Rabbi Shimon? Why do we have to say we can rely on Rabbi Shimon in the case of danger? In the case of danger, you can throw the whole Hilchos Shabbos out the window and do whatever has to be done. Says Rabbi Kiva, similar to what we just saw in the Leked Yosher, in the Trumas Hadeshen, says Rabbi Kiva, Rashi doesn't mean it's a full-blown Sakanah, it's a real, tangible danger. It's a remote possibility. It's real. It's real enough that we would set aside our normal policy of following Rabbi Yehuda and instead say Rabbi Shimon is an eminent authority. Let's be lenient like him. But it's not real enough to constitute full-blown pikuach nefesh that would allow overriding of Hilchos Shabbos, not even of muktzah. So once again, we see that when there are remote possibilities of danger, even if halacha considers them real and doesn't just dismiss them as wild, outlandish considerations, even if they're real considerations, they may not be enough. There is some threshold, some unspecified threshold, that if the danger, if the chance of danger is below the threshold, that is not grounds for violating Shabbos on a deraisa, sometimes not even on a drabana, not even on rabbinic law. So we see the same principle, that not everything that's statistically significant, not everything that can be acknowledged as sakana, acknowledged as dangerous, not everything is enough to allow a chil Shabbos. That still doesn't tell us, again, so what do we do? What do we do in practice? What are the rules that we use? So what are the rules that we use to decide what is considered a case? How great does the danger have to be? What is the threshold that the danger has to cross that threshold before it's considered yesh b'sakana, before it's considered full-blown, a full-blown at least possibility of mortal danger to allow for chil Shabbos, to allow for the violation of Shabbos, even on a biblically prohibited activity. So Rav Asher Weiss again brings a very interesting dispute between Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach again and Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer. Rav Weiss sides with Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman said that it is not objective. The definition of pikuach nefesh, of what is considered danger, not only is it not statistical, it's not even objective. It is subjective. It is a question of societal determinations, what human society, what humans, individuals, or collectively, what human beings consider dangerous. When people consider something dangerous, that is considered pikuach nefesh. When people dismiss something as a risk that's not worth, that they don't consider something particularly dangerous, that is not considered pikuach nefesh. So Rav Shlomo Zalman says this, bein l'chumra, bein l'kula. Both with regard to denying the possibility of violating Shabbos to save a life when society doesn't consider something that dangerous, even if objectively the halacha might consider it significantly dangerous. He invokes the principle of Shomer P'saim Hashem, that God watches over the foolish, that the Talmud sometimes says to justify people behaving in a somewhat risky way, but if society tolerates it, then the Torah tolerates it as well. Rav Shlomo Zalman invokes that principle to say we would not be Mechal Shabbos, even if something on paper, statistically, objectively, is something that is somewhat dangerous, but if it's something that human society, human beings consider acceptable risk and not especially dangerous, then we would not be Mechal Shabbos in such a situation. And the other direction as well, something that people do consider dangerous, even if it's not objectively that dangerous, it wouldn't be considered as a tangible and present danger, but if human beings consider it dangerous, that is enough to justify overriding mitzvahs, transgressing Shabbos in order to save lives. That is the position of Rav Shlomo Zalman, Auerbach, and Rav Asher Weiss. The Tzitz Eliezer of Waldenberg disagrees. He says, no, we work with, halacha does not care what people think. People have their own ideas. People have different ideas. There's no objective standard here. Halacha can't work like that. Halacha can't have such a supremely subjective definition. It can change all the time. Different people will have different standards. That's a completely intolerable way to establish halacha. Nasata devarecha l'shiurim. Halacha doesn't work like that. Halacha needs to have objective, prescriptive rules for what's considered danger. He strongly disagrees with Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's entire approach, and they argue back and forth about this. As I mentioned, Rav Asher agrees strongly agrees with Rosh Shlomo Zalman. Pshitali, it's obvious to me, he says, that Rosh Shlomo Zalman is correct. However, he says, Ein lahagzim ulahaflig, don't take it too far. Within reason, he says. Don't exaggerate and don't be and don't get too carried away with this. We're not going to start allowing the most preposterous things just because some people consider them to be life and death. We do have to have some corrective, some oversight over what people think. But in general, he says this is a classic idea for Rav Asher Weiss in general. Rav Asher Weiss very much likes the introduction of the subjective and in other contexts as well, refuses to accept rigid prescriptions, and he says we have to look at more subjective and qualitative notions. That's what he says here as well. He agrees with Rosh Shlomo Zalman that we have to look at we have to take a more subjective, less statistical, less objective definition of Sakanah nefashos. However, he says he does grapple with, we mentioned the Trumas Hadeshen, the Leked Yosher, B'Kiv Eger, who all say that even things that people, even poskim, consider somewhat dangerous, still don't justify Chil Shabbos D'Oraisa if they're relatively low risk. So he grapples with that. He has a subtle distinction. Not going to get into that right now. I'm not sure I fully understand it. But in any event, this is a fascinating and fundamental disagreement between Rav Asher Weiss and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach against Rav Waldenberg, whether Pikuach Nefesh is defined, that the standards are defined solely objectively based on halachic principles, whether strictly statistical or other considerations. But Rav Waldenberg says the principles are objective, whereas Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Weiss both say that they are somewhat subjective, that we have to look at how things are considered in human civilization, and they're not strictly based on objective criteria. I will add here that there is one other posek who also introduces a subjective notion of pikuach nefesh. This is a tshuva that is not, I think, perhaps as well known as it could be, but it's a deeply fascinating tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein, we need to discuss the context first a little bit. Rav Moshe Feinstein is discussing a halacha. The Gemara talks about, at least the way some Rishonim understand the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch talks about a case where someone wants to take a sea voyage, go on a ship, embark on a sea voyage sometime during the week, and the sea voyage will extend through Shabbos, which is fine. People do that today. People take cruises that you can be on a ship on Shabbos. However, what happens if on the ship it will be necessary to be Machal Shabbos? Normally, if you're a passenger on a cruise liner, nobody's asking you to be Machal Shabbos, but in a case where it's a small ship, the passengers have to pitch in, where it's foreseeable, it's expected that the ship will find itself in situations where there will be a need to Machal Shabbos. Pikuach Nefesh, the ship will find itself in danger, and in order to keep everyone safe, it will be necessary for the Jews who are traveling to be Machal Shabbos. So if you're on the ship already, and now it's Shabbos, Pikuach Nefesh, override Shabbos, you have to Machal Shabbos. Are you allowed to take the sea voyage in the first place? So the Shulchan Aruch paskins, based on the famous Shita of the Baal Hamar, his understanding of the Gemara, that you're allowed to take the voyage as long as you embark on a Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, not if you are embarking on a Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. That's too close to Shabbos. Even then, even Erev Shabbos, if you're embarking on a mitzvah journey, you're allowed to embark even then. But you're allowed to embark on the journey, certainly on a Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. You're allowed to embark on the journey, even though you know perfectly well that you will have to Machal Shabbos when Shabbos comes around in order to save lives, in order to preserve lives. Not all poskim agree. The Magen Avram says, some poskim say, no, that you should not embark on the journey, even on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. If it is expected that you will have to Machal Shabbos, even for Pikuach Nefesh, you should not embark on that journey. The Magen Avram, quoting the Knesset Gdola, then goes further and says, because of this concern that some poskim say you should not embark on the journey if you expect to Machal Shabbos, some people really wanted to embark on the journey anyway. So what did they do? In order to be yotzei all opinions, in order to satisfy all opinions, what did they do? They would simply risk their lives and they would avoid being Machal Shabbos. They would embark on the journey and they would avoid being Machal Shabbos when the ship found itself in danger. They would be mistaknen ba'atzmam. They would endanger themselves not to Machal Shabbos in order to satisfy all opinions. Rav Moshe Feinstein now is very puzzled by this. He says, what are you talking about? He says, The halacha is, it's virtually unanimous in the poskim, that in a case where life is in danger, you're not allowed to not be Machal Shabbos. You have to. It's not just a permission. You're obligated to be Machal Shabbos to save lives. Saving human lives is so important that you must be Machal Shabbos. It's not optional. So what do you mean they risk their lives? That's completely wrong. La halacha. That's suicidal. You can't do that, he says. And if they really considered it so dangerous, they shouldn't have gone on the ship in the first place, he says. So what kind of practice is this, he says, that people would go on a ship and then say, I'm not being Machal Shabbos because I want to be very pious. How does that make sense, he says? How can you do that? So Moshe Feinstein now introduces a subjective notion of Pikuach Nefesh to explain this. He says there are actually two standards of Pikuach Nefesh. There is one category of Pikuach Nefesh that is objective, that's universal and objective, and that there's nothing to talk about. You must be Machal Shabbos. If you're in a situation where there's a clear, objective, unambiguous situation of Pikuach Nefesh, that is not negotiable. That you must be Machal Shabbos to save lives. However, says Moshe, there is another category of Pikuach Nefesh where objectively we are not able to say it's dangerous, and it depends on a person's temperament. Some people are warriors, some people are scared, are nervous, and they consider this dangerous. Other people are bold and confident and are calmer and are not worried. Who's right? There is no right. It's objectively the danger is not high, but it's a matter of temperament. It's a matter of personality. Some people feel endangered in this situation. Some people do not. What's the halacha? Are you allowed to Machal Shabbos in such a case? Says Rav Moshe, it depends who you are. If you are somebody who is worried, then that is considered subjective Pikuach Nefesh. If you feel like you're in danger, you're allowed to Machal Shabbos. The Rav Moshe contrasts people who are Amitzlev, people who are bold and brave, people who are Mugelev, people who are soft-hearted, who melt in the face of danger. If they consider it Sakanah, if they feel in danger, they're allowed to Machal Shabbos. But objectively, it's not that dangerous. And if they feel brave, other people who feel brave won't be Machal Shabbos. Says Rav Moshe, what the Magen Avraham is describing is a situation like this. The danger is relatively low. These people in question were generally timid people. They were people who were timid and generally would consider this dangerous and would be Machal Shabbos. However, because they knew that if they were to have that attitude, they really shouldn't go on the boat, because some posts can say that you shouldn't put yourself in a situation where you have to be Machal Shabbos. So they steeled themselves, they strengthened their morale, they toughened up in order to say, we'll be brave, we'll consider this safe, and we're not going to be Machal Shabbos. So putting aside the specific case of the boat, Rav Moshe is telling us that Pikuach Nefesh, there are two types of Pikuach Nefesh. There are two types of mortal danger for the sake of Chil Shabbos. There's one level where the danger is objective and clear, and that's unambiguous, and everyone is Machal Shabbos for that. There's another level that is subjective, kind of like Rosh Zalman. And Rosh Zalman, Rav Asher Weiss in particular, say we don't have to look at every single person. We can look at what human society in general considers dangerous without looking at outliers. Rav Moshe doesn't say if there's any limit to this, but he says the halacha can vary by the person. A person who feels endangered would be able to Machal Shabbos. A person who does not feel in danger would not be able to Machal Shabbos. So that's an idea of Rav Moshe, which is very similar to Rosh Zalman in that he introduces a question of a subjective element to Sakanah, and like Rav Asher Weiss as well. However, the Tzitz Eliezer, as we said, rejects this idea and says the halacha doesn't care what people think. Halacha has its own objective standards for defining danger. That's what we look at. We're not interested in what people think, insofar as that diverges from the halacha's own definitions of danger. Now, I want to turn now to our last major topic of limiting principles and how to define uncertain danger. This is a discussion that begins with the Nod Yehuda. The Nod Yehuda was the first major, Rabbi Cheskel Landau in the 18th century, was the first major authority to discuss the permissibility of autopsies, medical autopsies, doing an autopsy of someone who died due to disease or due to some kind of physical problem. Specifically, he was talking about some kind of stone, Choli ha'evan bekiso, some kind of bladder stone, or some type of some type of painful, terrible affliction that would cause people to die. The physicians wanted to do, in London he says, The London physicians wanted to do an autopsy, a post-mortem autopsy of someone who died with this condition. What happened was actually that the physicians had done an emergency surgery, and 18th century surgery was not something that you would want to undergo if you had a choice. But the people have pointed out how painful the kidney stones, these stones are, that people actually underwent surgery without anesthesia because it was still preferable to the alternative. But in this case, they did the surgery and he died. And they killed him. And apparently he died because of the surgery. So the local scholars wanted to know, can they do the autopsy to learn more about the condition? And next time, hopefully, they'll do the surgery, they'll improve the surgical technique. Next time, maybe we'll save his life instead of killing him. We'll learn how to cut, where to cut, how to minimal incision surgery, and so on. So normally we don't do autopsies. It's a question of nivul hames, of disrespecting the dead. But there's a great cause here. We can save lives in the future. So basically, in a nutshell, abstractly speaking, a fundamental question, does the furtherance of medical research, of medical science, justify overriding the normal prohibition against nivul hames, against disgracing human remains? Says in Rabbi Yehuda, like most poskim agree that yes, even though it's a great mitzvah to respect the dead, but saving lives is more important. So on the one hand, he says yes, life-saving, it overrides Shabbos, it overrides most mitzvahs in the Torah, including the mitzvah to respect the dead. However, he says, I'm not convinced this is called pikuach nefesh, he says. Maybe you'll save somebody's life in the future. He says, no, that's not called pikuach nefesh. He says, Sakanah nefashos, pikuach nefesh. Throughout halacha means there is somebody, a concrete patient right here, right now, whose life you hope to save by whatever mitzvah you're transgressing. That's when we allow overriding mitzvahs and averos, he says. But the fact that you think in the future that if you advance medical science and surgical technique, you'll be able to save a life somewhere down the road, that is not a justification for doing an avera. You have to have a chola b'fanenu. You have to have someone here right in front of you right now. There's no general dispensation to do averas now in the hope that maybe sometime in the future you'll save lives. If so, he says, you'll do autopsies of everyone, he says, to learn more about anatomy, because if you learn more anatomy, you'll save lives in the future. That's reductio ad absurdum, he says. You can't possibly call that pikuach nefesh, and therefore he forbade doing an autopsy in that case. Unless there was someone right now you hope to save, the fact that you hope to advance medical science in general, advance surgical technique in general, and save lives in the future, that is not a justification for overriding a mitzvah like the prohibition against disrespecting the dead. Chasam Sofer takes this, agrees, endorses this view. He says that Chasam Sofer says the same thing. If there would be a chola b'fanenu whose life you could save, someone in front of us whose life we're hoping to save, we could do it. Almost certainly mutter, he says. But just because you hope to advance medical science, then that's not considered suffix pikuach nefesh, and there's no heter. You can't do that. He prohibits it as well. However, there is a lenient view. There is a view of some later achronim that push back against this stringent view of the Rabbi Yehuda and the Chasam Sofer. The Machne Chaim, Chuvas Machne Chaim, he says no. He says that for example, the Chasam Sofer said it can't be this is mutter. If so, we could just allow for studying medicine. We can allow going to medical school and doing any avera necessary on Shabbos in order to study more medicine. Says the Machne Chaim, no, that's because you can study medicine during the week. You don't need to do it on Shabbos. Because normally most preparatory things that will help you be a better doctor in the future don't need to be done on Shabbos. So that's why there's no heter of Chil Shabbos. But in the case of an autopsy where there is no way to advance medical science without doing autopsies, there is no substitution, there is no other alternative to doing this, he says. Then he says there is a very good argument that this could be mutter. He says, even the Rabbi Yehuda and the Chasam Sofer who are machmer, that's because they were afraid that they would autopsy all patients as a matter of course. They didn't want to open that. They didn't want to open that Pandora's box, he says, or for other reasons, he says. But the Machne Chaim, in principle, thinks that even if there's no chola b'fanenu, even if we're just trying to advance medical science for the future, if there's no other way to accomplish that goal, he is inclined to the view that it could actually be permitted. And this point was made even more forcefully by Rav Yehuda Leib Graubart, the author of the Chavalim B'nai Imim, a great Rav from Lithuania, later in Toronto. He says, in the time of the Rabbi Yehuda, he says, the the autopsies and the communications. The patient was a patient who with this exact same condition was rare. The idea that you can actually help somebody based on what you would learn, medical science was much less advanced than today. He says that's why he prohibited it, because realistically he feels, Yehuda felt it wasn't that likely that you're going to accomplish much. It's not really what Rabbi Yehuda says, but that's how he understands Rabbi Yehuda. He says today it's maisim b'chol yom. It's a daily occurrence. He says that we do autopsies, and it's one of the essential tools that that the field of medicine has. Is we study anatomy, we study different types of medical conditions by autopsies. He says, and people who need these operations are frequent. It wasn't a rare. Back then, in the 18th century, you didn't do a surgery unless there was literally no choice. It was a relatively rare thing. Today, surgery is much more common. He says it's obvious that an autopsy is pikuach nefesh mamish. If we don't allow them, lots of people will die. He says so there's no question. He says it's common sense. We're going to save lives by allowing autopsies. He says we have to do it. He says it has to be mutter. He makes the same point as the Machnei Chaim. He says that. Otherwise, you could just do everything on Shabbos. You could just open pharmacies and make medicine and do everything on Shabbos. No, that's because you could do it during the week. You don't do it on Shabbos because there's an option of doing it during the week, he says. Prepare medicines in advance and so on. But in our case, where there's no alternative to doing autopsies, he says, that then it's mutter. He thinks it is absolutely mutter. The Chazon Ish has a much quoted interpretation of this halachic dilemma, although what exactly he means is open to a lot of interpretation. He brings in Rabbi Yehuda and the Chatzim Sofer, who require that there has to be, in order to be matir chil Shabbos, we don't allow for future speculative chil Shabbos. There has to be someone right now that we're hoping to save. The Chazon Ish says it doesn't really matter if there's another person here or not here. That's not the right way to express the distinction. Rather, what is the distinction, he says? He says it has to be matzui hadavar, it has to be frequent and likely, he says, as opposed to dvarim asidim, future things that v'hove ein lehem kol zecher, that there's no tangible connection to the current time. He says we're not bekiyim ba'asidos. Who can predict the future? He says we don't really know what's going to happen in the future. Many things that we think are going to be helpful turn out not to be helpful, and we can't make decisions. We can't allow chil Shabbos because of what he calls asidos rechokos, far-flung things in the far-flung future or remote possibilities. He says we can't be making. What exactly the Chazon Ish is doing here, how he's different from the Rabbi Yehuda, is in a matter of probabilities. He says it doesn't matter if he's here or not. It matters whether it's rechokos or matzui. Very hard to understand exactly what he means. But he also acknowledges that there's some kind of limiting principles. Not quite. He doesn't think it's as simple as Rabbi Yehuda says, with whether there's another chola here in front of us, another sick person here or not here. But he also says that there's some kind of distinction between speculative future pikuach nefesh and current pikuach nefesh. But exactly how to define that, he is not entirely clear. Ramosha Feinstein has a couple of tshuvas where he discusses this idea as well about doing pikuach nefesh things for the future. So he actually disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. In one tshuva discussing autopsies directly, he disagrees. He agrees with halacha, but not for the same logic. He says in Rabbi Yehuda's distinction between current and future, he says is implausible. It's not logical. He says, what does it matter? He says you're going to save lives. Who cares whether the lives you're going to save are today or tomorrow or next year? He says, what does it matter? He says, if you're going to save lives, you're going to save lives. He says that he calls this dachuk, he says, because there are clearly people who need it. Certainly today, where we have much better communications, we can find people all over the world, he says. It's easy to connect and find other people, he says. What kind of reason is that? Because you don't have a concrete person in front of you. He says, that doesn't matter. He says he doesn't like Rabbi Yehuda's reason, but he has a new reason. Ramosha says something very curious, something very interesting. He says there's a great mitzvah to save lives. The mitzvah is, if you have the knowledge and the capability of saving a life, there's a great mitzvah to save a life, and that mitzvah overrides other mitzvahs like Shabbos. However, he says, if you don't know how to save a life, but you can learn, you can go to medical school and learn, he says, that's not a mitzvah. It's a nice thing to do, he says, but we don't call that the mitzvah of saving lives. Once you're a practicing doctor and you're saving lives, you get a mitzvah for saving lives. You're mechuyev to at that point. You're obligated to. but there's no mitzvah in advance to go to medical school to learn how to save lives. Therefore, he says, doing an autopsy, going to medical school is not considered a mitzvah that can override Shabbos, let's say, or override Nivul HaMeis, because right now you don't have the capability of saving a life. The fact that after you learn how, you'll know how, that's not a mitzvah you have right now. I don't really understand the logic of this, but this is what Ramosha says. He says it in one tshuva about autopsies. He says it in another somewhat explosive tshuva about Kohanim going to medical school. Apparently, Rav Shimon Schwab asked Ramosha, some anonymous author had published, some author, he doesn't mention his name, published a pamphlet arguing that Kohanim could go to medical school, even if it involves coming into contact with the dead, which is normally prohibited for a Kohen, tumas meis. This author wanted to argue, there's a lot of discussion about this, it's a big topic, we're not really going to go through all the arguments for and against tonight, but this Chacham, this anonymous scholar, had written that going to medical school is pikuach nefesh, because doctors can save lives, and therefore, even if it involves Yisurim, even if it involves prohibitions like tumas meis for a Kohen, doesn't matter. Pikuach nefesh overrides almost all prohibitions in the Torah, and therefore a Kohen can go to medical school because it's a matter of pikuach nefesh. Says Ramosha, this is shtus v'hevel. This is nonsense and idiocy. He says that no intelligent person would ever say such a thing. He says because he says the same distinction he said before. He says the mitzvah is if you know how to save somebody's life, you have a mitzvah to save his life. There's no mitzvah to go to medical school to learn how to save lives. And therefore, he says, you can't call that a mitzvah that would override, you can't call that a mitzvah pikuach nefesh that would override other mitzvahs in the Torah. Furthermore, he says, there's other doctors, it won't be you, there'll be one less doctor in the world. There are enough doctors, he says, Ramosha claims, and therefore it's not pikuach nefesh. In any event, so we have the position of the Nod Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer, who say that there has to be chola b'fanenu, there has to be someone clear and present in danger right in front of us. We have the position, others push back against that, the Machne Chaim, Chabalim B'neimim, and say as long as there's a clear, solid chance of saving lives, that's enough. We have Ramosha, who has his unique svara, who says that there's no mitzvah to learn how to save lives, only once you already know how, so you can't override prohibitions based on the fact that you want to learn, because as long as you don't yet know how to save lives, there's no mitzvah, Ramosha claims, and therefore you can't override pikuach nefesh. Returning for a moment now to coming back to Rav Mordechai Halperin again. He tells another story about Rosh Zalman and Rav Elyashiv. He says in Tufshin and Beis, so that's 92. There was a question as follows: a child was given a hepatitis vaccine, and his condition deteriorated badly, and he died several hours after getting the vaccine. There was a concern that there was something wrong with the vaccine, a bad batch or a contaminated batch, and the authorities wanted to do an autopsy of the child to see whether we should pull this batch. If we find out the batch is contaminated, we better pull it off. So nobody else should be given this thing. So the question was, would halacha allow this? We saw the whole discussion in the poskim about autopsies, whether to save lives you can do an autopsy. So they asked this question to Rabbi Elyashiv and Rav Shlomo Zalman: Could we do an autopsy of this child in order to save lives? Says Rabbi Halperin, the chance that the vaccine was actually the cause of the child was very low. Millions of children had gotten similar vaccines in Chutz La'aretz, even in Eretz Yisrael. Thousands of children in Eretz Yisrael. Nobody was harmed by it. There is a chance that there was some contamination, but it was a very low probability. Ein holchet achar rov. We don't normally follow probabilities and roves when it comes to pikuach nefesh. So what's the halacha? Can we do the autopsy in the chance that maybe on the off chance that there was a contaminated vaccine batch, maybe will help save the lives of more children? They decided to ask Rav Elyashiv. So when they told Rav Elyashiv the question, Rav Elyashiv, similar to his position earlier, began to emphasize how the chance of really accomplishing anything by the autopsy was relatively low. The chance of actually gaining some actionable intelligence from this vaccine, from this autopsy, was quite low, and he was not inclined to. He was hesitant to allow the autopsy. So respectfully, Rav Halperin says he told Rav Elyashiv what happened in the story of the missing kid, that after he had gone to Rav Elyashiv, who had said it's not pikuach nefesh, he had gone to Rav Shlomo Zalman, who had said that it is pikuach nefesh. So he told Rav Elyashiv the story. So Rabbi Yashiv smiled at him and said, fine, so go ask the question to Shlomo Zalman if you want. If you want his opinion, go ask Shlomo Zalman what to do about the vaccine. So I listened to Rabbi Yashiv. I went to Shlomo Zalman. He heard all the facts and details, and he said unequivocally, do the autopsy. Risk of chance of saving lives, pikuach nefesh. Once again, l'shitasam, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach held, chances are low, chances are remote, doesn't matter. Human life is so precious. The imperative of saving lives is so critical that even if there's a very small chance of saving lives and it's a remote possibility, we'll do it. Whereas Rabbi Yashiv said, if you can't really point to a solid, then again, we have to fit this into all the other things we've been discussing. Rabbi Yashiv, once again, was hesitant to just define any remote possibility of saving lives as pikuach nefesh, and he therefore was reluctant to allow the autopsy. So finally, just to tie together a lot of what we've seen, I'll quote one last tshuva of Rav Asher Weiss. Rav Asher Weiss was asked in 2020. This was in the spring or summer of 2020. Before the COVID vaccine had been developed, the scientists, medical researchers were working hard on developing a vaccine. The tshuva is dated Hey Sivan Tufshin Pei. So Sivan around Shavuos time, 2020. So there was a Jewish medical researcher working at Mount Sinai in Manhattan, and he was part of a group that was working hard on developing a COVID vaccine. And he felt that they were close to a breakthrough. He felt that they were nearing a breakthrough, and he asked, "Can he work on Shabbos? Can he work round the clock, 24/7?" He wanted to work on Shabbos because he felt they were close to a breakthrough, and developing the vaccine could save lives. So Rav Asher brings a note to Yehuda, brings the Chasam Sofer that for potential future pikuach nefesh, we don't allow Chil Shabbos. Brings the Chazon Ish, brings the Machnei Chaim, and so on. Brings all the literature back and forth, and he says you could argue based on the stringent view, the Note Yehuda, the Chasam Sofer, the Chazon Ish, that we don't allow violations of Shabbos in order to promote medical research, even if it's important medical research. If it's future and speculative, we don't allow Chil Shabbos. On the other hand, Rav Asher then turns around and makes kind of the common sense point. He says Be'emes, he says, we're dealing with a terrible pandemic, he says, worldwide pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Thousands of Jews have died, he says. Even those who are healthy are at risk, he says. Rav Asher was took COVID very seriously. He says that certainly we're commanded to do whatever we have to do to save Jews, to save people, he says. So he says that furthermore, he disagrees with Rav Moshe. He says that in a case where there's a near certainty that you can save lives, even if there's no mitzvah incumbent upon you, the mere fact that he says, at least if it's karav levad, at least if it's a near certainty, it's a great mitzvah, and even if it's not a mitzvah, he says it still overrides pikuach nefesh, still overrides Shabbos. So he says you can argue this research is so important and it likely will save lives. So he says, despite all the hesitancy of earlier authorities to allow averas, to allow transgressions like disgracing the human remains or Chil Shabbos for the sake of medical research, something that's so pressing, a pandemic, and we can save so many lives, he says, intuitively, you can make a strong argument that we should allow Chil Shabbos. Halacha l'maaseh, he says you cannot. In practice, he says you cannot, because he says you can't point to you can't draw a direct line between working an extra few hours on Shabbos and saving lives. He says it's going to be months. In the best case, he says, all the doctors say, before they're going to have a vaccine suitable for widespread use. He says it's very implausible that one particular researcher, he works a few more hours on Shabbos, that's going to save lives. He says, do all the researchers, do they really work 24/7? Do they not take any time to be with their families? He says, that's how science works. Even when it's in a crisis, even when it's important work, you don't really work 24/7. Human beings can't function like that. Everyone takes breaks. Everyone takes some time off from work. So your time off from work should be on Shabbos. Come in earlier during the week, work an extra couple of hours during the week, and to make up for the time on Shabbos, he says. So in practice, he says, even though he goes back and forth whether it could be argued that vaccine development is considered life-saving and would be considered a question of pikuach nefesh that override Shabbos, in practice, you can't really call medical research similar to what we saw in the Machnei Chaim, that the reason medical study of medicine is not Docha Shabbos is because you can do it during the week, he says. You can't really say that there's a critical, absolute need to do this on Shabbos. And therefore, he says that such an open-ended, indefinite thing is not grounds for violating Shabbos, so he does not allow it. Thank you all for listening. This is obviously a very big topic, and there is a lot more to say on it, but we've gone on quite enough about this, so we'll call it a night. I'm happy to take questions either now or in the future. And again, thanks for bearing with me, and thanks for joining us. Have a very good night.
Okay, let me stop the recording. Actually, I'll leave it on for questions. I am going to unmute everyone, which is going to mute you, Rabbi Grossman, so you'll just remember to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Questions in the chat also.
Okay, so I'm looking at some of the stuff in the chat. Someone asked about the case of the Hanukkah and the Gemara, the menorah, whether it had to do with Shabbos or the week. I think the Persians didn't tolerate fire according to their religious rules. During the week, it's not an issue. During the week, just take the menorah away. But there's no chil Shabbos. You're worried about if you take it away shortly after lighting it, maybe you won't be yotzi the mitzvah. We paskin that if a menorah goes out after you light it, you are yotzi the mitzvah anyway. Even if you yourself put it out, if you weren't intending to do it to begin with. Yeah, so I think during the week it would just present much less of an issue. But the primary issue was Shabbos, and the primary issue was Shabbos, and
So I guess another aspect of this that I was thinking about is that we also light candles on Shabbos. So you could use that same, you could raise the same concern for every Shabbos of the year. But I guess the difference is that for Hanukkah, we're supposed to be pursuing Nisa, and so we put the Hanukkah in a place where hostile neighbors will see it, and we don't do that with the Shabbos candles.
right. Shabbos candles are almost entirely for internal purposes.
Yeah.
To provide illumination inside your house, while the Ner Hanukkah ideally should be placed where the public can see it. Right. So that's why I guess they got into more trouble with the Persians because of that. Yeah.
Okay. So that's why this question was specifically for Hanukkah.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Probably.
Okay, first question in the chat.
Let me see. The one about Ava?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Michael Lauer also asks about I mentioned in passing, it wasn't the theme of our talk tonight, but I mentioned in passing that according to Talmudic law, we would not be Mechal Shabbos to save non-Jewish lives. And the concern that was raised was if we don't care for him, if we don't treat non-Jews, it might lead to hostility to the community. So that is something that is extensively discussed in the halakhic literature, and that is I mentioned earlier in my talk tonight. I mentioned that today physicians generally will treat non-Jews on Shabbos, and this is really the reason, and this is the primary reason, because we're afraid that we don't want to antagonize the world, and we don't want to engender this kind of hostility. Even though the Talmud doesn't seem so concerned with that, but things have changed today for various reasons. The potential for hostility, the potential for communication and for mobs and for getting people around the world all riled up. That's what halakhic authorities over the generations have said. The Talmud also agrees in principle this is a concern. Just in the time of the Talmud, in practice, this was considered to be less of an issue for various reasons. But today, the poskim generally assume that the consequences of discriminating against non-Jews would be intolerable, and that's why, by and large, the halakhic authorities universally, I think, pretty much do say that we treat Jews and non-Jews equally. I quoted a bunch of stuff from Rabbi Halpern tonight. So in the course of preparing the share, I came across an article. It was published. How long ago is this? I don't know. It doesn't matter. But I came across an article where Rabbi Halpern is quoted as quoting Rosh Shlomo Zalman as saying, "Kishmagia chola goy b'Shabbat," when a non-Jewish patient arrives on Shabbos, "Tapel bo k'mosha matapel b'Yehudi." Treat him the same way you treat Jews. La halacha, the poskim say that even though the Talmudic law might be different, but la halacha today we generally do treat non-Jews the same way we treat Jews. We have another question here in the chat. Let's see. Question is a Jewish midwife again, it's related to what we just discussed. The question is a Jewish midwife driving to non-Jewish patients on Shabbos. So as we said, doctors today do treat non-Jewish patients. Midwife would have the same dispensations. The doctors do treat non-Jewish patients, and even if it involves Chol Shabbos Deraisa. So the question is, it's two steps removed. They're not Jewish, and it's only a suffix. As we said, a childbirth is considered a relatively low risk activity compared to classic Sakanah. So here there are two issues. It's both a non-Jew and a suffix. An interesting point, but I think the Halacha would still say that at the end of the day, to avoid antagonizing and provoking the non-Jewish world, I think the Halacha would probably still be that we would treat the non-Jew. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous discussions of this idea that if the risk of antagonizing the non-Jews is severe, we treat the non-Jews, actually was said in the context of midwives. There's a tshuva in the Chasam Sofer about 200 years ago. He was asked about a case where apparently traditionally the people used to use folk midwives without any certification, no oversight. The government was trying to impose oversight and certification. So the government apparently had issued a regulation that nobody was permitted to attend a birth, to give birth without using a registered and certified midwife. In a certain town, the only certified midwife was a Jew, a Jewess. So all the non-Jews had to use her. And she wanted to know whether it was permitted al pi halacha, because the halacha says a midwife shouldn't help birth non-Jews. And the Chaburah said yes. He said yes. He said because it's a question of Eva. Again, he said that insofar as we have a real concern that if we don't treat the non-Jew, we could have there could be serious repercussions. So he allowed it again, despite the fact that childbirth is only a suffix pikuach nefesh. Again, because the justification here is not based on the pikuach nefesh. The justification here is based on the fact that if we don't treat the non-Jew, then we're gonna pay for it, and the consequences will be severe. The consequences will be severe for a midwife as well, and therefore the Chasam Sofer and later poskim did say that with respect to midwives as well, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Grossman.
Thank you.
Yashikov.
Thank you, Rabbi Grossman.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. This was fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Uh,